Coming up today, North Korea pulls the plug on UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon's planned visit to an inter-Korean factory park in the north. The UN chief is scheduled to meet President Park Geun-hye this afternoon in Seoul. A top US official says Washington is considering permanently stationing a controversial US missile defense system in South Korea, but he insists nothing has been finalized yet. Plus, the youth unemployment rate in Japan is going down as Japanese firms bring more of their overseas operations back home. But it's a different story for Korea's young people as local companies plow more money into production plants abroad. Stay tuned for these stories and more. Hello, it's noon on Wednesday, the 20th of May. You're tuned in to our midday newscast here on Arirang TV. Thanks for joining us. I'm Mark Broom. And we start with North Korea's predictably unpredictable decision to cancel UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon's planned visit to the inter-Korean Kaesong Industrial Complex. Speaking at a forum in Seoul on Wednesday morning, Ban said the North informed him of its decision through a diplomatic channel earlier in the day, but offered no explanation for its sudden change of heart. Pyongyang's about turn comes a day after the UN chief announced his plan to visit the joint business park on Thursday. Ban said the North's decision was regrettable, but he stressed that he will continue to urge Pyongyang to cooperate with South Korea and the rest of the international community for the sake of peace and stability. Now, earlier on Wednesday, North Korea slammed South Korea for refusing to raise wages for North Korean workers at the complex. Pyongyang's main propaganda website claims the wage issue is a deliberate strategy on the part of the South to destroy the Kaesong project. Now, the UN chief is busy making the rounds, dropping by to speak to the country's political leaders as part of his visit to Korea. Ban Ki-moon and President Park Geun-hye will meet this afternoon for talks on ways to achieve peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and South Korea's contributions to the international community. Prior to his meeting with the President, Ban, a former Foreign Minister of Korea himself, will meet with the current Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se. This morning, the UN chief visited the National Assembly and met with Assembly Speaker Jung Ui-hwa and the floor leaders of both rival parties, where they discussed ways to strengthen ties between South Korea and the UN. Now, this is Ban's first visit to his homeland in nearly 2 years. The United States is considering plans to permanently dispatch a US missile defense system to South Korea to counter the growing threat posed by North Korea's nuclear and missile programs. US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Defense Policy and Verification Operations, Frank Rose, says Washington is weighing the costs and benefits of deploying Terminal High-Altitude Area Defense, or THAAD, as it's usually known, but stressed a final decision has not yet been made. Rose said THAAD is a purely defensive system that will improve the Allies' ability to intercept incoming short and mid-range missiles from North Korea. Now, responding to the US official's remarks, South Korea's presidential office said that if the US makes a formal request, the South Korean government will decide whether or not to give it the green light after assessing THAAD's pros and cons. The potential deployment is a thorny issue inside and outside of South Korea. China and Russia have stated their deep opposition to it, saying it will threaten their national security. Now, more international experts are raising doubts over North Korea's claim that it successfully test-fired a submarine-launched ballistic missile early this month. Vice Chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, James Winnefeld, strongly called the claim into question, saying the North manipulated its recent test launch video to exaggerate progress in its SLBM development. During a discussion in Washington on Tuesday local time, the U.S. military official stressed that Pyongyang is years away from having such a capability. However, he added that should North Korea eventually develop its SLBM technology, it would present a serious danger to South Korea, Japan, and American service members stationed in the region. Now, Japan is pushing to list dozens of industrial facilities that used thousands of forced laborers from Korea and other countries before and during World War II as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And as you'd expect, Korea is not happy with this and has made its feelings very clear to the head of the UN agency, who is here for the World Education Forum. Kim Hyun-bin reports.
UNESCO Director General Irina Bokova says nothing has been decided on regarding the 23 industrial sites Japan has registered for the UNESCO World Heritage List. Speaking to press at the World Education Forum in Seoul on Tuesday, Bokova suggested that Korea's concern over Japan's efforts might be better resolved through open talks.
I personally have encouraged both sides to engage in a dialogue. I know that there will be a bilateral meeting between Japan and the Republic of Korea, and I hope that there will be a solution found.
Korean Foreign Minister Yoon Byung-se met with Bokova earlier in the day to convey Seoul's strong opposition to the listing of facilities related to Japan's wartime atrocities. During Japan's colonization of Korea from 1910 to 1945, Tokyo coerced hundreds of thousands of Koreans into slave labor. Roughly 60,000 of them were forced to work at 7 of the 23 industrial sites that Japan has put up for World Heritage status. As far as Seoul is concerned, Tokyo's campaign clearly goes against the universal values of UNESCO. The South Korean government plans to appeal the application to UNESCO, hoping to sway voting members before the final decision in Bonn, Germany on June 28th. Kim Hyun-bin, Arirang News, Seoul.
Now, pension reform is, more scholars from around the world have joined the signing of a landmark statement that calls on Japan to face up to its wartime history, and that includes its sexual enslavement of women. Nearly 500 historians have signed this letter in a growing show of support against Japan's attempts to whitewash history. Son Jung-in has more.
On May 6, a group of 187 historians from around the world, including the US, Europe, Australia, and Latin America, sent an open letter to Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, urging him to address Japan's history of colonial rule and wartime sexual slavery, a rare move by world-renowned scholars targeting a global leader. But it did not stop there. Since the letter was issued, an additional 269 scholars have asked to add their names to the list to support the effort. They include not only historians but also political scientists and literature and religious studies scholars. All of them support the evidence showing that Japan held tens of thousands of women against their will and forced them into sexual slavery under the systematic management of the military during World War II. The scholars also urged Japan to apologize for the suffering it caused other countries during the war and raise concerns about a new and counterproductive atmosphere within Japan that seeks to limit open discussion of history. The letter was sent just months before Abe is scheduled to issue a statement in August to mark the 70th anniversary of the end of the war. He is under mounting pressure from the international community to make a heartfelt apology for Japan's past wrongdoings. Son Jung-in, Arirang News.
The defense ministers of Korea and Japan will hold their first bilateral talks in 4 years later this month on the sidelines of a security meeting in Singapore. Japan's Kyodo news agency reported Tuesday that Seoul's defense minister Han Min-gu and his Japanese counterpart Gen Nakatani are expected to talk about speeding up an agreement on sharing military information. The Japanese minister will also introduce Tokyo's new guidelines for US-Japan defense cooperation. Now, pension reform is topping the agenda at Korea's National Assembly again today, with the two main rival parties hoping to find another way of shaking up the system. A special committee on pension reform is discussing how to overcome a deadlock in negotiations that has continued since earlier this month. when the parties originally agreed on a bill to reform the pension system for public servants. Attached to the bill was a plan to reform the much larger National Pension Service by increasing national pension payouts by 10%. But the presidential office and some in the conservative ruling camp are opposed to the payout increase, which has left the civil servant reform bill stuck in limbo. Korea's youth unemployment rate is on the rise, but the opposite is true in Japan, where the youth unemployment rate has been dropping over the last couple of years. Kwon So-ah tells us why.
Disappointing figures in Korea showed that last month's unemployment rate for people ages 15 to 29 was at the lowest ever recorded in the month of April, since the data were first compiled in 1999. Earlier this week, government data showed that the number of Koreans in their 20s and 30s with no job experience at all had reached a 12-year high. And recently, the OECD reported that Korea's first quarter youth unemployment rate stood at 10.9%, while Japan's came in at 6.1%. What's more is that the numbers in Japan have been improving since the second half of 2013. This has a lot to do with Japan's trend toward reshoring, in which a growing number of Japanese companies that had production bases abroad are returning to Japan, creating more jobs in the domestic manufacturing sector. Experts say the reshoring drive was prompted by the weak yen and rising labor costs in countries such as China and Southeast Asia. Renowned Japanese firms like automaker Nissan, electronics makers Panasonic, and Sharp have already announced plans to bring some manufacturing back to Japan. But in Korea, the opposite is happening as big-name companies expand their businesses abroad. For example, top automakers Hyundai Motor and Kia Motors saw their overseas output jump tenfold between 2004 and 2014. While many agree that Korea needs to continue expanding its economic territory abroad, they've also emphasized a need to address the negative effect on young job seekers as companies reduce the number of new recruits. Kwon So-ah, Arirang News.
Now, short-term floating capital in Korea's financial system rose to an 8-year high this year. In March, the amount amounted to 20.7% of Korea's total liabilities, a record high not seen since 2007. Short-term floating capital includes all physical money, such as cash, checking accounts and demand deposits. The central bank and industry analysts say many investors have put their financial assets into short-term financial products. This means investors are still refraining from putting their money into long-term investment products due to low interest rates and the economic uncertainty. Now, it's going to be the largest recall of a consumer product in U.S. history. Under pressure from U.S. authorities, Japanese airbag manufacturer Takita has agreed to declare airbags in some 33.8 million U.S. vehicles defective. Now, explaining the reason behind the recall, the U.S. Department of Transportation and the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration said on Tuesday local time that the chemical that inflates the airbag can explode with too much force, and this could potentially spray pieces of metal and other dangerous debris into the passenger compartment. And they say the faulty inflators have been responsible for 6 deaths worldwide. Now, 10 major automakers, including BMW, Ford, Honda, Mazda, Nissan and Toyota, have already issued recalls for around 17 million vehicles, but Tuesday's announcement has almost doubled the number of vehicles that need to be recalled to almost 34 million. Just to give you some context, that's nearly 1 out of every 7 cars on US roads today. Now, death has often been portrayed in works of art as an attempt to try and understand it. And a famous opera on this taboo subject is being performed at this year's Korea Opera Festival that is currently taking place at the Seoul Arts Center in southern Seoul. Our cultural correspondent Kim Ji-yeon reports.
If death were to be expressed in song, then the opera Il Trittico, a masterpiece by Giacomo Puccini, would say it all. This omnibus work is comprised of 3 one-act operas. Each interprets death differently as a state of hell, purgatory, and heavenly release. In particular, the soprano who stars in the second opera, Nun Angelica, played by Kim Eun-hee, stands out. In her aria, she expresses a desire to see her dead son before she meets her own death.
It's very powerful. That aria is a very powerful aria. Every single time I sing that aria, my heart's just beating like a crazy. Because, the mother love's just overpowering.
Operas are known to have sad and dramatic endings, but in the finale of the Il Trittico, it somewhat ends on a comical note. Can you tell us more about the ending of the play?
In this opera, you have three kinds of death. And the last one has a little bit, cynical approaching to death. Everyone has their eagerness and their, hope, wishes that shows humans, desire. So it shows a little bit, oh, probably that's me. You can see that, oh, that person's just like me, or my father, or my aunt, something like that. So you can really connect to some characters. It would be fun.
It's one of the 5 pieces at this year's Korea Opera Festival, which runs until June 7th. Kim Jeon, Arirang News.
Well, those are the stories we have for you on this Wednesday afternoon here in Seoul. For more of the latest, don't forget to check out our website, arirang.co.kr/news. Goodbye.